Welcome to another edition of AP World History at University High School. All right, the Cold War is one of the most interesting things you're going to study in this class, mainly because it's just cool. A lot of movies about it, and it's very recent, and the effects of it are still definitely with us. And in kind of some ways, it's not really all that over, actually. But let's get going. So you have the United States and the Soviet Union here, and it's not just about these two countries, but the ideologies as well. Because so we've got on this side democracy and capitalism, and on another side communism and a command economy, and under communism there are different forms of it. It's communism / socialism. It looks different in different parts of the world. You know, I mean, China, once it does become communist, is not going to be Stalinistic. And yeah, so let's get started. These two ideologies, you have to understand, are very opposed to one another. Communism is bent on expanding, and then the United States policy becomes one of containing the spread of communism. Containment. That's going to be the U.S. policy for a number of decades. In 1945, first of all, in 1945, before we even get started, the United Nations is created. The United Nations, this world body, governing body to maintain world peace, to deal with major world issues, the United Nations. We know the League of Nations failed to prevent another world war. It's pretty powerless. The United Nations is going to have a peacekeeping wing of it. It is going to be military forces, but they are also going to be very limited as well. They're not going to be able to do a whole lot, the peacekeepers, but still it's there, it's something. And there's a Security Council to deal with major security threats around the world. The Security Council has 15 members, 10 of them are temporary, but 5 are permanent. And the 5 permanent members are really important. It's the USSR, China, which in 1945 is not a communist country, the United States, France, and Great Britain. These are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, so you can imagine. And they all have a veto power. So these two countries are often going to veto one another, the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1946, former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he's going to be re-elected later on, I think in 1948, as Prime Minister of Great Britain, so he's a former Prime Minister, gives the Iron Curtain speech, and here is a little excerpt from it. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control directly from Moscow. So what he's talking about is, well, here's the Iron Curtain. It's not an actual curtain. It's not a physical wall at all. He's talking about the fact that Europe is divided now, and the Soviets have established puppet communist governments in Eastern Europe. Here Churchill's trying to peek underneath that Iron Curtain by order of Joe. Joe who ordered this Iron Curtain? If you said Joe Stalin, you've been paying attention in class. Here's another Iron Curtain, don't fence me in, made in Moscow. So this is what he's talking about. The fact that here's the USSR, first of all, they expanded their territory and took more land from Poland. But these Eastern European countries of Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, they had communist governments established within their countries. And they became really a puppet government spheres of influence of Moscow. And that is very troublesome. Now, this is the situation in the world. This is the most important thing for Western nations. And look at Germany as well. We'll talk about Germany in a minute here. So Europe is polarized. In blue, you have democratic or at least non-communist governments. And then in red, you have what are called the Soviet bloc or the Eastern Bloc countries. It's the Soviet Union and their Eastern European allies. Notice Yugoslavia, it is also communist, but it wasn't part of this alliance, actually. So again, the polarization of Europe. Let's move on to March 1947. This is the President of the United States in March 1947. Anybody remember his name? If you said Harry Truman, you'd be correct. Harry S. Truman, goes before Congress in 1947 to deliver a speech, and he's asking the Congress of the United States for money, and he wants this money to assist certain people around the world, namely in Greece and Turkey. For what reason? What he says here is extremely important. By the way, his ideas are going to be influenced by some advisors, and it's going to direct American foreign policy for the next 40 years. We don't focus a lot on when we talk about the Cold War, we're not going to focus on the battle between the U.S. and USSR, but rather what that battle, and it's not a physical battle, it's just an ideological battle. It's just an ideological one. What that is actually going to do to various countries around the world, okay? Like in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and places like that, in Latin America. So what he outlines here is going to influence many parts of the world for the next few decades, and it becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. He says, I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. What is he talking about there? He's talking about communists when he says armed minorities or outside pressures. Where? It was specifically in Greece and Turkey. They were actually battling some potential communists that wanted to come to power, and he was asking Congress for money to send aid to those people who were battling the communists because they didn't want to see the spread of communism. This becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine. And another note for that, or another word, a single word for this Truman Doctrine is containment. Containment. The policy of containing the spread of communism. That took many forms. Sometimes it was the use of military, but that was extreme. Oftentimes it was sending financial assistance, it was propaganda. A number of things were done to try to contain the spread of communism because, again, it was seen as a threat to the very existence of the United States. Think of what Stalinist Soviet Union was like, and think of what life is like for you in the United States. It's very different, right? And, okay, so let's move on to June 1947. This is the Secretary of State of the United States, but you see he's dressed in a military outfit. That's because during World War II, he was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I believe, basically in charge of all the military. His name is George C. Marshall. And as Secretary of State, the Secretary of State of the United States mainly deals with like foreign policy. He devised something called the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan was a plan to provide aid, material and financial aid to European countries in order to create strong foundations and allies, foundations of nations, and then allies against communism. And the theory behind that comes a little bit from the speech that President Truman gave as well. He says something in that speech. He says that the seeds of totalitarianism, that's like Nazi, that's like Hitler and Stalin, right? Totalitarianism. The seeds of totalitarianism are sown in the soil of want and misery, meaning totalitarianism comes when people are in poverty, and Europe at this time is destroyed. And if we allow it to stay in this condition, another kind of Hitler might come to power, right? Because that's what happened in Germany. And so the Marshall Plan, and that should be a double L there, of course, the Marshall Plan sent lots of money to which countries? Notice which countries. Spain is fascist at the time, kind of. It's under a dictatorship anyway. But it's all the democracies, right? There's Greece and Turkey, Italy, Austria, West Germany. We'll talk about that in a minute. Scandinavia, Britain, France. Britain and France, of course, received the most, and then Germany. Did they not offer funds to Romania and Poland and Czechoslovakia? No, they did. But here we see an example of the Soviet sphere of influence there. The Soviets would not allow these countries to accept this foreign money. So the Marshall Plan aid went to these democracies in Western Europe to help rebuild them, and they did. The United States sent lots and lots of money. That contributed to a huge growth in the U.S. economy because we also sent material, the iron and railway cars and tools, what have you. And those were produced here in the United States, which means jobs and jobs and jobs for Americans, and the economy in the United States in the 50s really grew. So again, this is the money that was sent, or the U.S. aid in dollars, but it wasn't all just money that was sent. Again, it was material as well. More Marshall Plan. So again, this is part of the policy of containment. The goal there is to do that in order to make sure that communism does not sprout up there. Okay, let's move on to 1948. In 1948, remember that we looked last week at what happened at the Potsdam Conference. Germany was, or actually I think it was Yalta, Germany would be divided into 4 zones. The Soviet, American, French, and British zones. Not only that, the city of Berlin was also divided in 4 zones. An eastern zone up here. By the way, the city itself was all in the Soviet zone. An eastern zone in the city, and then an American one, a French one, and a British one. And what this cartoon is illustrating is something that the Soviets did in 1948, and that is that they blockaded Berlin. You got to put that in your notes. It was the Berlin blockade. Why would they do this? They blockaded the roads, by the way, not airports. And all these roads, you can take this road from like the American zone, for example, or the British zone, into the West German area. They blockaded it to kind of like force these West Berliners to depend on the Soviet area. And when they do that, the Soviets, of course, grow in influence, and then all of Berlin can fall to the communists as well. So they blockaded it. And the Americans said, oh, no, you don't. They tried a way around it, and that was what became known in your notes there as the Berlin Airlift. So the Berlin blockade led to this Berlin Airlift. The Soviets blocked the railways and roads from West Germany into Berlin in order that they might gain that full control of the city of Berlin. So this airlift was supplies being flown in around the clock nonstop into West Berlin, milk and clothing and food and medical supplies. And it was kind of a treacherous mission. Planes did crash. A number of pilots died, but the city survived. So here you see again the British, French, and American zones and all the airports that were feeding West Berlin there again, which was inside the Soviet zone. So airplanes lined up around the clock to bring this stuff in. This is Captain Gale Holverson, who's nicknamed Captain Wiggly Wings, because every time he would fly by, he would drop little candy bars with these cute little parachutes for the West German kids to indulge in, and he told the kids that you know when Captain Wiggly Wings is coming because he'll wiggle the wings of the plane. So that was Gale Holverson, or maybe Halverson. I think it was Holverson. So again, it was kind of treacherous as well. There were 101 fatalities. 200,000 flights brought 13 million tons of food in. So it was hailed as a success. The Soviets lifted the blockade in 1949. Let's move on to the next part of your timeline there. And in April 1949, this was created. Guess what this is? It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or for short, NATO. NATO. And when you look at these flags, some of them are what used to be some communist countries, like this one right here. I'm pretty sure that's Bulgaria. Or is that Hungary? I always forget the two. They look kind of similar. This is the Czech Republic, which was Czechoslovakia back then. That was communist as well. So what is this? Well, when it first started, NATO, I'll show it to you on a map in a second, but NATO is a military alliance between the Western democracies. So it's mainly Western European countries that are democracies, Greece and Turkey as well, Canada, and the United States. It's a military alliance. An attack on one NATO nation is an attack on all NATO nations. It's a military alliance. It's not like the UN, which is like a world governing body for peace. This is an alliance of defense. Let's move on to what year is this actually? August 1949 there. It's not on the timeline. It's not on my PowerPoint here, but on your timeline, the USSR also tests its first atomic bomb successfully. So now the Soviets have the bomb too. And the tensions during this Cold War, as it's called, have risen even more. So by the way, again, it's called the Cold War because the US and USSR never went to war against one another. It's a war of ideologies that plays itself out through assassinations, political pressure, economic barriers, sometimes proxy wars, which are like hot wars in Vietnam or in Korea, where communist and non-communist sides did battle, and the Soviets and Americans might have like assisted them militarily. Okay, so in 49 September 1949, Germany is officially divided into two separate countries. So the whole goal initially was that it would be rehabilitated and united into one country, but in the Soviet zone, a communist government was established. So East Germany is going to be a country for the next 50 years, actually. No, yeah, 40 years, exactly 40 years. And West Germany, a democratic country, West Germany. In 1949, an event of critical importance happens. The communists defeat the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. Let's back up a little bit, actually. I forgot to mention Germany for a long time, and not just Germany, but more specifically, the city of Berlin. It becomes a major symbol of the Cold War, a major symbol, especially when the Berlin Wall is going to be built. So it's a symbol of the Cold War. There's East Berlin and West Berlin. A lot of people from the East flee to the West. There's tension there of like invasion all the time from both sides. But let's move forward again to China. This is the most populous country on Earth. Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang flee to the little island of Taiwan. This is important because from there they establish the Republic of China. And the United Nations refuses to recognize the giant country of the People's Republic of China, Communist China, the People's Republic of China. They refuse to recognize them as China on the Security Council and in the UN. And instead, little Taiwan is on the Security Council, and they are recognized as the rightful representatives of the Chinese people. So remember that moving forward, because that's not going to change for almost 3 decades. What do you see on this map? It's a satellite picture of the Earth. Find Korea. And if you said Korea is right here, you'd be correct. But that looks weird because Korea is not an island, it's a peninsula. And it looks like this is a big body of, this is water separating Korea from the mainland of Asia. But that's not water. This is a nighttime satellite picture. And here's Japan, right, all lit up. So what is this? This is a modern day picture, of course, of the peninsula. And we zoom in. This is Korea's 2 countries today, South Korea and North Korea, and you can see the stark differences in the development of these 2 countries. How did this happen? Okay, so Korea is also going to be administered by, in part, I think, by the UN and the United Nations and the Soviet Union, because it was occupied by Japan during World War II. So the Soviets help establish a communist government up here, and the Americans a non-communist government down here. There is a pretty strong American force in Japan still at the time. This is like in 1949, 1950, and in 1950, the forces of North Korea, which is they're not officially a country yet because their goal was to reunify, but many people in the North, well, the leaders in the North, wanted to establish a communist government, and they had some military support and moral support from the Soviet Union. They invaded the South. They invaded militarily and pushed out the Americans, pushed them deep, 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 all the way down to here, I think, I forget where, Incheon, no, Pusan, and then the Americans were able to launch a counterattack at Incheon and pushed the North Koreans way back. So who is the leader of this North Korean country? His name is Kim Il-sung, the dear leader. This guy ruled North Korea for almost 50 years. What is that? 46 years. For 46 years, he's the leader of this country, communist North Korea. So if you don't know anything about it, you should read Barbara Demick's book, Nothing to Envy. Nothing to Envy. It's a fantastic book about ordinary life in North Korea. And everybody in the country has to have his picture on the wall. This is the dear leader, as well as his son, Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il. And now his grandson is ruling the country. So 3 guys really have ruled this country since 1948. What is that, 70 years or something like that? Only 3 people, and they're all father, son, and grandson. So the Korean War begins because the United States, because of its policy of containment, and because China had fallen to communism, they don't want to see communism spread again. So let's look at the timeline map here. Check it out. So the invasion happens. They push the American forces all the way back to Pusan, but a counterattack at Incheon forces the North Koreans way up north. But then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, look how much ground was lost. That's because China committed something like over 1 million troops to this fight. And when they did that, and the United States and China are at war with one another in North Korea, it changed the game big time. there would be a lot of casualties. This is sometimes called the Forgotten War. So look at the effect when the Chinese entered the war. And they pushed very deep south, and then all of a sudden it's a stalemate. Notice for like 2 or 3 years we're all kind of along this line, and that's how it ended, in a stalemate. The Korean War is officially not over. It's just a ceasefire. It's a ceasefire, and the ceasefire was signed at a place called Panmunjom. Panmunjom is somewhere around here, right around this line called the 38th parallel. This 38th parallel. By the way, this was not a war that the United States declared. Instead, they called it a police action. A police action. So notice it's the American flag and the United Nations flag, because there were like Turks in this war. There were a lot of other nationalities fighting this war. And in the north, we've got the communist flag of China and the Soviet Union, as well, of course, as mainly North Vietnamese troops. Or, excuse me, North Korean troops. This is Panmunjom today, looking from South Korea into North Korea, and they're still just staring at each other. The United States still has like 25,000 troops in South Korea. The war is officially not over. So 40,000 Americans were killed, 400,000 Chinese troops were killed, 2.2 million total military deaths. That, I don't know, that seems kind of high. I don't know if it was that high. Must have been a lot of North Koreans as well. But 2.5 total million total killed or wounded. So this was a very bloody war. And again, you see the policy of containing communism in action there. It ended kind of in a stalemate. Stalin dies in 1953, and this man, Nikita Khrushchev, is the new head of the Soviet Union. I forget his official title. He's going to be a very important figure for the next about 15 years, 13 or 14 years actually, in the Soviet Union. So remember Nikita Khrushchev's name, and we'll stop right there for today and pick up another session next time. So this is just part 1. Thanks for coming.